Viewer discretion is strongly advised. If you're uncomfortable with topics dealing with war crimes, extreme violence, or mentions of genocide, please click away now. Between the end of World War II and the early 1990s, Europe enjoyed a relatively peaceful period of history. Besides the Troubles, a low-intensity conflict between Northern Irish paramilitaries and the UK, the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, and the Prague Spring, Europe hadn't seen any significant military conflict until the last decade of the 20th century. Known as the first major wars on European soil since World War II, the Yugoslav Wars claimed the lives of around 140,000 people between 1991 and 2001. Besides dividing the once socialist utopia into 6 new countries and contributing to ethnic tensions that last to this day, the Yugoslav Wars also set the stage for Europe's most recent genocide. Between July 11th and July 22nd of 1995, around 8,000 boys and men were brutally murdered by the army of Republika Srpska. Women and girls were tortured and raped, and thousands were forced to leave their homes and escape, all because the Bosnian Serb leadership aimed to create an ethnically homogeneous Serb territory. You're watching The Dig, and this is the story of Srebrenica, Europe's forgotten genocide. Until July of 1995, the small mining town of Srebrenica in Bosnia and Herzegovina was known only locally as a popular spa destination for people within the country and the ex-Yugoslavia. A town that was founded back in Roman times thanks to its favorable geographical location and wealth in silver ore, Srebrenica's name comes from the Bosnian word for silver, srebro. Mining soon became the town's primary source of income, and would be the main quality that attracted the Ottomans and later the Austro-Hungarian Empire to the area. The town's natural mineral water springs, Crni Guber, Black Goober, was developed into a crucial part of the local economy during the Austro-Hungarians. In fact, the Bohemian company Matoni founded a distribution infrastructure for tapping and exporting the water Guber Quell, Guber Spring, all over the empire and throughout Europe. The existence of Srebrenica's mineral springs also allowed for the construction of a spa, which further contributed to the development of a small rural town that soon had electricity, roads, schools, and a postal service. Srebrenica suffered both during World War I and World War II. During World War I, the area of eastern Bosnia and the Drina River were the region's primary battlefields. The Kingdom of Serbia and the Austro-Hungarians fought endlessly, ultimately resulting in an Austro-Hungarian win. After the end of the war, however, the Austro-Hungarian Empire came crashing down, and Bosnia became part of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later renamed the First Yugoslavia, or the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. When the Axis forces invaded Yugoslavia on April 10, 1941, the era of the First Yugoslavia came to a close. A large chunk of today's Croatia and most of the Bosnian territory became the independent state of Croatia, a fascist puppet regime controlled by Ustaše under Ante Pavelić, notorious for the horrors they committed at the Jasenovac and Stara Gradiška concentration camps. Srebrenica again saw unimaginable horrors, when both Ustaše and Chetnici, extreme Serb nationalists, committed war crimes against the people of Srebrenica. Today, Srebrenica is home to a partisan memorial cemetery for the victims of the war. Under the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia between 1945 and 1992, Srebrenica developed into a popular tourist destination within the country. Banja Guber, the town's spa, was built in the mid-1970s and attracted up to 90,000 visitors until the early 1990s, with an estimated annual revenue of around $3 million. This small, picturesque town, surrounded by greenery and medicinal water, transformed into a war-ravaged inferno following the country's declaration of independence in 1992. Still, Srebrenica wouldn't see the worst of it until the summer of 1995. To understand how the genocide even took place, we must understand the socio-political circumstances that it happened under. Following the death of Josip Broz Tito, Yugoslavia's founder and president, in May of 1980, national and ethnic tensions began increasing. Without a strong central figure, a power vacuum appeared, and nationalist leaders started emerging and promoting ultranationalism. Among the most vocal ones was Slobodan Milošević, who started gaining prominence after visiting Kosovo Polje, a small town near Pristina in Kosovo in 1987. The people of Kosovo started protesting as early as 1981 due to poor economic conditions, feelings of oppression, and to potentially break off from Yugoslavia and become a republic. This resulted in a dozen people killed, thousands arrested, and serious repression of Albanian political activism. By 1987, tensions between Serbs and Albanians were extremely high in Kosovo. So on April 24th of that same year, Milošević gave a speech to support the Serbian cause. Among the best remembered moments was when Milošević said to the crowd, quote, "Nitko ne sme da vas bije, no one has the right to beat you," end quote. Thanks to the fact that the entire event was broadcast all over Serbia, Milošević became a beacon of light for Serbian nationalism, fueled by an increase in uncertainty for the future that seemed everything but bright. Milošević's quick rise to prominence was best seen through the anti-bureaucratic revolution, a campaign of street protests between 1988 and 1989, led by his supporters. The goal was to re-centralize Yugoslavia's leadership that has been severely decentralized since the 1974 constitution, which allowed for an increased autonomy in each republic, with even Kosovo and Vojvodina, the two autochthonous provinces, having nearly equal voting power to that of actual republics. The protests ultimately overthrew the government of the Socialist Republic of Montenegro and those of Vojvodina and Kosovo, replacing them with Milošević's allies. The outcome of the anti-bureaucratic revolution led to serious worries in other republics, especially Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia. Seeing Milošević's policy as a direct threat to their autonomies, the fear of potential Serbian expansionism caused Slovenia and Croatia to declare independence in mid-1991. This is when things went from bad to worse. The Yugoslav People's Army, YPA, also known as Jugoslavijska narodna armija, led primarily by Serbian leadership, intervened almost immediately. Slovenia fought the 10-day war, resulting in 66 casualties on both sides, and the Slovenian win on July 6, 1991. The war in Croatia, however, lasted 4 years, and by the end of it, in November of 1995, over 15,000 people lost their lives. Franjo Tudjman, the first Croatian president and leader of the Croatian Democratic Union, or Hrvatska demokratska zajednica, was a central figure during the war, being also known as the quote-unquote architect of Croatian independence. The events in Slovenia and Croatia soon inspired Bosnia to declare independence too. Following Bosnia's secession from Yugoslavia on March 1, 1992, all hell broke loose. See, the Yugoslav wars weren't only about the YPA protecting the territories of the once socialist haven. The fact that the population was ethnically heterogeneous in every republic was the crux of the problem. This issue was especially prominent in Bosnia because, as the most ethnically diverse of all republics, it was impossible to satisfy everyone's wants and needs. Bosniaks, Muslims, primarily wanted independence, whilst Bosnian Serbs favored Milosevic's policies, and Bosnian Croats aimed to create a separate Croat-controlled territory inside Bosnia known as the Croatian Republic of Herceg-Bosna between 1991 and 1994. So, this variety of political affiliations and differing alliances made the Bosnian War the most brutal of all the Yugoslav wars. So, how did we get from the fall of Yugoslavia to Srebrenica? Well, not long after Bosnia declared independence, the Bosnian Serb leadership founded the Army of Republika Srpska, VRS, led by Ratko Mladic, now a convicted war criminal. The army's primary goal was to defend Serb-controlled territories within Bosnia, and ultimately unite those areas with Serbia or a new Serbian-dominated Yugoslavia. As a response, Bosniaks formed the Army of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which didn't only fight the Bosnian Serbs, but also the Bosnian Croats, who insisted on annexing Herceg-Bosna to Croatia. The Croat-Bosniak conflict lasted between 1992 and 1994. Among the biggest goals of the Army of Republika Srpska, VRS, was ethnic reconstruction, aka cleansing, of its territory. Before Srebrenica, the VRS conducted 6 different cleansing campaigns between 1992 and 1995. In Prijedor, where thousands were detained, abused, and killed. Foča, where nearly the entire Bosniak population was expelled, but not before the VRS soldiers organized detention centers for rape, later ruled as crimes against humanity by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Visegrad, considered among the worst campaigns, where mass killings of civilians were conducted, with people being burned alive in their houses. Zvornik, where civilians were, once again, mowed down in cold blood. Sanski Most and Ključ, where nearly all non-Serb civilians were expulsed or killed. And finally, the siege of Sarajevo, where the so-called Sarajevo Safari took place, a campaign where wealthy foreigners paid to shoot at civilians with snipers during the siege. It's safe to say that the VRS was just warming up for what would eventually go down in July of 1995 in Srebrenica. Considering Srebrenica and surrounding areas were important for the VRS as a bridge to disconnected parts of the envisioned ethnic state of Republika Srpska, Srebrenica and the whole area near the Drina River were heavily attacked all throughout the war, resulting in Srebrenica becoming isolated by Serb forces in mid-1992. The first cleansing campaign took place already between April and June of 1992, when around 3,000 people were killed. The VRS and the Army of Bosnia and Herzegovina under Nasser Oric fought endlessly for Srebrenica between 1992 and 1993. Oric used the town as a staging ground to attack neighboring Serbian villages and had caused the death of hundreds. Due to Oric's men hoarding food and beverages, Srebrenica was on the verge of starvation by March of 1993, with some civilians dying of hunger in the streets. The situation was dire, causing the UN to intervene and proclaim Srebrenica a safe area in April of 1993, protected by UN peacekeepers. This also meant that the town was partially demilitarized, with UN troops only lightly armed, all while the VRS controlled the wider area of eastern Bosnia. People started flocking to the town, and in just a few months, the population went from 9 to 60,000 people. Due to the surge in population, people lived in abandoned buildings. Young Muslim women resorted to prostitution to support themselves and their families, and black markets started flourishing. To make matters worse, humanitarian aid convoys were frequently blocked by the VRS, causing Srebrenica to be a besieged enclave despite its UN status. By mid-1995, the situation in Srebrenica was horrible. Although he was advised to end the war, the president of Republika Srpska, Radovan Karadžić, issued the so-called Directive 7, in which he told the VRS to, quote, create an unbearable situation of total insecurity with no hope of further survival or life for the inhabitants of Srebrenica, end quote, in order to physically separate the enclaves of Srebrenica, Žepa, and Goražde. Although weak, these enclaves represented something the VRS so desperately wanted to get rid of. Those who didn't think like they did, and those who'd always be one step away from defying them. Between July 6th and 11th of 1995, the VRS fought against the Bosnian government forces, as well as the UN peacekeepers, for the total control of Srebrenica. The 6,000 Bosnian soldiers were pushed out of town in 2 days, inspiring Karadžić to authorize 1,500 more VRS soldiers to finally occupy Srebrenica. NATO intervened through airstrikes on July 11th, but due to poor visibility, the attacks were stopped. Fearing the VRS might bomb the UN Potocari compound, where Dutch and French military hostages and around 30,000 refugees were located, NATO gave up on any future intervention. Mladic and his goons were seen walking triumphantly through the town's empty streets in the late afternoon of July 11th. It was official. Srebrenica had fallen. The horrors began immediately. As early as the next morning, the VRS began setting houses on fire and conducting summary executions of men. Men and boys were separated from women and children and later taken to the so-called White House, where they were tortured and killed. According to witnesses, streets were covered in blood and corpses. Many victims were buried alive, and many were even willing to commit suicide to avoid being mutilated and tortured by VRS forces. CNN reporter Graham Jones reported parents were forced to watch soldiers kill their children. Women were raped endlessly, with many witnesses testifying that VRS soldiers would beat the woman unconscious to allow for easier access. Girls as young as 9 years old were raped, and according to testimonies of many victims, UN soldiers were aware of the violence against women, with many being around while the rapes were taking place. Pregnant women were stabbed in the stomach, and Ramiza Gurdic, member of the movement of mothers of Srebrenica and Žepa enclaves, who lost 2 sons and a husband, recalls how a group of VRS soldiers beheaded a young boy in front of his mother. Kada Hotic, another woman who survived the horrors of Srebrenica, remembers how VRS soldiers slit the throat of a baby that wouldn't stop crying. The column of Bosnian men that formed on the evening of July 11th would become central to the genocide. Between 10 and 15,000 men and boys formed a column with the army of Bosnia and Herzegovina's 28th Division to escape the horrors that already commenced in Srebrenica and Potocari. The column moved mostly through forests and aimed to reach Bosnian-held territory of Tuzla. VRS forces had ambushed the column at Kamenica Hill on July 12th, with the VRS attacking the 28th Division and column with chemical weapons. Those detained were executed the same day or a day later. when the first mass executions of the Srebrenica genocide took place in Bratunac, Konjević Polje, and Kravica. The boys and men, mostly of military age, that attempted to escape the ensuing inferno in Srebrenica were the genocide's primary victims. July 13th is when the genocide officially commenced. The men that were separated from women in Potocari, around 1,000 of them, were transported to Bratunac and joined the ambushed men from the column. Most were killed in a mass execution on July 13th north of Srebrenica. That morning, 17 Bosniaks were killed on the banks of the Jadar River. The early afternoon saw 150 boys and men lose their lives in the first mass execution in the valley of the river Cerska, near Konjević Polje. The Kravica massacre that took place in the late afternoon of July 13th brought to a close one of Bosnia's bloodiest days. Between 1,000 and 1,500 men from the column that were captured near Sandići were brought to Kravica. Upon arrival, the men were forced into a warehouse where VRS soldiers threw hand grenades and fired rocket-propelled grenades against the captives. According to testimonies, around 300 men were executed en masse with concentrated machine gun fire before the warehouse massacre occurred. The bodies were either dumped into mass graves or thrown into the nearby river. Between July 13th and July 18th, the VRS summarily executed hundreds of Bosnian men, women, and children in Bratunac and Konjević Polje. The VRS stole UN uniforms and vehicles that made the Bosniaks feel safer, only to mow them down in cold blood shortly thereafter. On July 14th, multiple mass executions that lasted for days commenced in different areas of eastern Bosnia. First in Tišća, where men and boys traveling from Potocari to Kladanj were removed from the rest of the group and killed. Then in Grbavci and Orahovica, where prisoners were taken to a school gym, around 1,000 of them, before being blindfolded and taken in smaller groups to meadows a kilometer away and shot in the back. Once one meadow was filled with bodies, the VRS started conducting executions on another one. Mass graves were being dug in the meanwhile. Between July 14th and July 15th, around 2,000 men were taken from Bratunac to a school in Petkovci, where they were repeatedly assaulted and even forced to drink their own urine. At this point, it was clear that the VRS had a clear pattern of how the executions were taking place. The prisoners were usually brought to an abandoned location where they were beaten and abused before being blindfolded, stripped to the waist, and shot in the back on a nearby meadow or in a secluded location. A survivor who successfully escaped the massacre at Petkovci recounts his experience, saying, quote, "I didn't know whether I wanted to live or die anymore. I decided not to call out for them to shoot and kill me, but I was sort of praying to God that they'd come and kill me," end quote. This alone speaks to the fact that death was, for many, preferable to what awaited them at the hands of the VRS if they survived. The Branjevo military farm massacre is widely considered to have been the worst execution campaign of the entire Srebrenica genocide. On July 16th, over 1,000 men were killed in a same day. The brutality of the VRS is recounted by another survivor who said the following, quote, "When they started shooting, I threw myself on the ground. One man fell on my head. I think that he was killed on the spot. I could feel the hot blood pouring over me. I could hear one man crying for help. He was begging them to kill him, and they simply said, 'Let him suffer, we'll kill him later,'" end quote. To make matters even worse, VRS soldiers executed 700 more men and boys at the Dom Kulture in Pilica, a building in the town center. Based on the scene of the crime, Bosniak men were killed by grenades and bullets. It's estimated that the Kozluk massacre occurred around the same time as Branjevo. Close to 1,000 men were executed on the banks of the Drina River. Although Bosnians living in Germany alleged that a massacre occurred in Kozluk as part of the Srebrenica genocide, due to no survivors, there was no proof of it, until 1999, when a mass grave was discovered near Kozluk. That same day, around 100 men were killed between Nezuk and Baljkovica. The last remaining survivors of the column that weren't captured yet were ambushed near Baljkovica and either killed in combat-like circumstances or outright executed. Those that survived reached Tuzla shortly thereafter. The last mass executions took place near Machisi between July 20th and July 21st. According to convicted war criminals Karadzic and Mladic, VRS soldiers used megaphones to lure Bosniaks who fled from Srebrenica to the Machisi area, promising they'd be safe. Of the 350 who responded, 150 people were forced to dig their own graves before being killed. By July 22nd, the killing campaign ran out of its victims in custody, so the VRS forces began focusing on concealing the signs of what went down. In fact, between August and October of 1995, most bodies were removed from primary grave sites and reinterred elsewhere to complicate the recovery and identification process of the remains, since bodies would become commingled and dismembered. As a matter of fact, in one case, the remains of one person had been found in two different locations, 30 kilometers apart. Following the Dayton Agreement and the end of the Bosnian War in late 1995, the first efforts to identify the victims of the genocide had begun. Led by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and local forensic teams, the identification process relied on clothing, personal items, and visual recognition by families. Because the VRS had moved the remains multiple times, the identification process was arduous and, more often than not, unsuccessful. From 2001 onwards, however, identification was facilitated through DNA tests. As of 2020, the International Commission on Missing Persons identified 6,993 persons missing from the fall of Srebrenica. The total death toll is 8,331 victims. In 2003, the Srebrenica Genocide Memorial was opened to honor the victims of the genocide. Every year on July 11th, newly identified victims are buried there. For 6,671 victims of the genocide, the memorial is also their final resting place. The memorial is open to visitors every day from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., free of charge because, quote, in many cases, whole families were wiped out in the genocide, and there is no one to testify and talk about them, end quote. One of those stories is also of the Muminovic family. Father Fehim and two sons, Suljo and Saudin, perished in the genocide. Only Nura, the wife and mother, survived. Nura recounts the moment her and Saudin were forcefully separated in Potočari. Nura said, quote, I pleaded, telling the soldiers, I don't have any money, but I do have a new house that's never been lived in. I will give it to you if you give me back my child, end quote. The Muminovic men were all killed in the following days. Nura, unfortunately, didn't see the day her husband and sons got identified. With the state of the world we live in today, stories like this one are so important to remember. What has been happening in Gaza eerily reminds us of the summer of 1995 in Srebrenica, where thousands lost their lives because of hatred and inhumanity. Although the monsters behind the carnage in Srebrenica have mostly been brought to justice, justice will never knock on the doors of the families whose lives have been forever changed by these events. Their husbands, sons, fathers, brothers, and grandfathers will never come home. Their grief will never yield. Their broken hearts will never mend. Death takes something from everyone who experiences it, but it creates a living dead of those whose loved ones were taken so brutally and so mercilessly. In the case of Srebrenica, between 20 and 30,000 people haven't really lived since July of 1995. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching. Topics like this are difficult and painful, but we must keep alive the stories of those who are no longer around to tell them. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more important topics that are yet to be covered. Until next time.